There's a kind of silence that only happens after something impossible. Not the silence of a quiet morning or an empty room. The silence of grown men. Men who have crawled through deserts with broken bones. Men who have held their breath underwater for 4 minutes. Men who have watched friends die and kept moving, going completely, utterly still. That was the silence in that helicopter bay. 12 Navy SEALs. Hardened, decorated. The kind of men that other soldiers told stories about. And every single one of them was staring at a woman they had never met, trying to reconcile what their eyes were telling them with everything they had ever been trained to believe about war, survival, and who gets to be the one doing the saving. Their commander, a man who had survived 3 combat tours, 2 ambushes, and 1 explosion that should have killed him outright, was alive. Because of her, she was standing apart from them. Rifle still warm. Hand steady in a way that suggested steadiness was something she had built piece by painful piece over years nobody in that room had witnessed. She wasn't looking for their approval. She wasn't waiting for their reaction. She had already moved on in her mind to the next problem, the way people do when they have spent so long being underestimated that other people's shock stopped being interesting a long time ago. One of the SEALs, a Master Chief with a jaw like a cinder block and eyes that had seen the worst corners of 4 different continents, leaned toward the man beside him. His voice was barely a breath. Is she the one they talk about? Nobody answered him out loud. They didn't need to. This is the story of Elena Vasquez, a woman who was never supposed to be there, who was never supposed to survive long enough to matter, who was never supposed to become the thing that operators whispered about in forward operating bases from Kandahar to Djibouti. This is the story of what it costs to be that person, what it takes from you, what it leaves behind, and what happens the day the world finally has no choice but to see you. Elena Vasquez grew up in a town that the rest of the country drove through on the way to somewhere better. Laredo, Texas, right on the edge of the Rio Grande, where the air smelled like dust and diesel and something faintly chemical that nobody ever bothered to name. It was the kind of place where the landscape itself seemed to be warning you, where the sky went on forever in every direction and there was nowhere to hide from anything. Not the heat, not the poverty, not the feeling that your life had already been decided before you were old enough to argue about it. Her father, Rodrigo Vasquez, was a Border Patrol agent who worked the night shifts and came home in the mornings with his jaw clenched and his eyes carrying things he never talked about. He was a quiet man, not cold, not distant, just economical, the way people get when they have seen enough of the world's worst business to understand that most conversation is just noise. He taught Elena to shoot when she was 7 years old, not because he thought she would need it professionally, not because he had any vision of her future that included rifle scopes and tactical operations. He taught her because he loved her, and he was a man who expressed love through the practical, through capability, through the belief that a person who could take care of themselves in a crisis was a person who would be okay no matter what the world threw at them. The first time Elena held a rifle, a .22 caliber that her father had used since his own teenage years, worn smooth at the grip from decades of use, she didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She looked down the sights with the same focused patience that her teachers would later describe when talking about how she did math problems or read instructions. She took her time. She breathed the way her father showed her. And she hit the tin can on the fence post from 40 meters on her 3rd shot. Rodrigo Vasquez didn't say much. He nodded once, the way he did when something happened that met some internal standard he carried around. But Elena saw the corner of his mouth move. That was everything. She was not the kind of girl who had a lot of friends growing up. Not because she was unfriendly, but because she was difficult to categorize, and children are deeply uncomfortable with things they can't categorize. She was too quiet for the loud kids, too sharp for the ones who coasted, too physical, always climbing, always running, always measuring distances with her eyes and figuring out how things worked for the ones who stayed inside. She existed in a kind of comfortable isolation that she didn't experience as loneliness until she was much older and had the vocabulary to understand the difference. Her mother, Carmen, worked at the hospital as a nursing assistant. She was a warmer person than Rodrigo in the ways that were visible. She hugged easily, laughed loudly, filled the house with the smell of cooking that she approached with the same obsessive precision that her husband applied to everything else. But under that warmth was an iron thing, a stubbornness that Elena inherited in full. Carmen had grown up in poverty that made their current modest circumstances look like luxury. She had worked her way out of it by deciding, at an age when most children were still figuring out how to tie their shoes, that she would not be defeated by her circumstances. She passed this decision down to Elena the way other mothers pass down recipes. Not through lectures, through example, through the way she got up every single day and did what needed to be done without performance, without complaint, without waiting for anyone to notice. Elena Noticid. She was 12 when her brother Marco was killed. It happened the way too many things happened in Laredo, at the margins, in the spaces between the official version of events and what everyone in the neighborhood quietly understood. Marco was 19. He was not a bad kid. He was a kid who had made a series of decisions that placed him in the wrong location on the wrong evening. And the violence that found him, there was not interested in context or fairness or the fact that their mother had been praying for him every night for 2 years. Elena did not cry at the funeral. Not because she didn't love Marco. Not because she was in shock or denial or any of the states that the school counselor suggested when she called Elena in and sat across from her with that specific kind of professional gentleness that felt, to Elena, like being handled. She didn't cry because somewhere in her, in the place where her father's economy of expression had taken root, grief had converted itself almost immediately into something harder and more directed. Something that didn't have a name yet, but that she could feel the shape of. She started running after that. Every morning, before school, in the dark and the heat, through the streets of Laredo while her parents slept. She ran the way other kids her age were starting to drink or smoke or retreat into screens, as a way of processing something that had no other outlet. But running did something else to her too. It taught her that her body was a tool, that it had capacity she hadn't found yet, that discomfort was navigable, that limits were more negotiable than they looked from the outside, that the voice in your head that said stop was just a voice, not an authority. She also kept shooting. By 14, she was routinely outscoring adults at the informal target shoots that happened on her uncle's property outside town. Not by a little, by margins that made people check her targets twice and look at each other with a particular expression of people revising their expectations. Her father watched her from a lawn chair with a soda in his hand, and that same quarter-inch movement at the corner of his mouth that was the closest he came to pure joy. What Elena had, and what she would not be able to fully articulate until years later in a debrief room in a classified location when someone finally asked her directly, was not just talent. Talent is a word people use when they don't want to account for the work. What she had was an unusual neurological relationship with stillness. At the moment of maximum pressure, in competition, in crisis, in any situation where most people's bodies flooded with cortisol and their hands started to shake and their vision narrowed, Elena's nervous system did something different. It slowed. It quieted. The world got cleaner, not messier. The noise dropped out, and what remained was just the problem in front of her and the sequence of actions required to solve it. This was not a gift she had asked for. It would not always feel like a gift, but it was hers. She joined the army at 18, not because it was the family tradition her father had never served, and not because she had a political relationship to it or had grown up romanticizing uniforms and medals. She joined because the structure called to her, because she understood, on some wordless level, that her particular combination of abilities needed a context that could use them properly, and because in the weeks before she signed her paperwork, she sat at the kitchen table with her parents, and her mother looked at her with those eyes that had seen everything and said nothing that could be quoted, just looked at her the way you look at something you have built when you understand is finished and ready, and that was enough. She went in as a 68W, a combat medic. The Army's MOS system had specific ideas about what roles were appropriate for women in 2003, and none of those ideas involved the word sniper. She knew this going in. She had calculated for it. She went in as a medic because it was the role that would get her closest to the operational environment, and she had already decided that proximity was the first step. Basic training at Fort Jackson was not easy. It was not easy for anyone. But the particular flavor of not easy that Elena experienced had an extra ingredient that the men in her cohort didn't have to navigate. The constant, low-level radiation of doubt coming from every direction. Not always spoken. Not always conscious. Just present. The way humidity is present. You can't see it, but it sits on everything and makes everything slightly heavier. Drill sergeants who push the men harder because they assumed the women needed less. Male trainees who oscillated between wanting to protect her and wanting to see her fail, both impulses rooted in the same bedrock assumption that she was fundamentally operating in someone else's territory. She outscored every person in her cohort on the rifle qualification. Every single one. She said nothing about it. She didn't smile at the men who looked at her targets. She just cleaned her weapon and went back to her bunk. She served her first deployment in Iraq in 2004, attached to an infantry unit out of Fort Hood. She was a medic. She treated wounds and called medevacs and did the essential, brutal, unglamorous work that kept people alive in a war zone. But she was also watching. She was watching the way the operational environment worked. Who made the decisions and how? Where the leverage points were. What the difference was between a unit that functioned and a unit that didn't. And she was watching the snipers. There was a staff sergeant named Briggs who was attached to their unit for 6 weeks. He was a quiet man who reminded her faintly of her father. That same economy of movement and expression, that sense of a person who had long ago stopped wasting energy on anything that didn't matter. She watched him work from whatever observation point she could manage. She asked him questions in the evenings, direct questions that some men found presumptuous from a female medic, and that Briggs answered without apparent judgment. He answered them because they were good questions, and because in his experience, the only people who asked questions like that were the people who were actually going to do something with the answers. Before he rotated out, he said one thing to her. Not advice, exactly. More like an observation. You've got a gift for the long game. She filed that away in the place where she kept everything that mattered. Compact. Organized. Not forgotten. She put in for sniper school in 2006. The application was rejected. She put in again in 2007. Rejected. She put in a third time in 2008, and this time she did something different. She had, in the intervening years, quietly accumulated a record, a documented record of marksmanship scores and field assessments and performance reviews from officers who respected her enough to be honest on paper. She attached all of it. She wrote a single paragraph that was so factually precise and so devoid of emotional appeal that the officer who read it later told a colleague it was the most unusual application he had ever seen. Not because it was passionate, because it was simply comprehensively correct. There was no argument to make against it that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. She got in. The training was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had done hard things. It was hard in the physical sense, the extended field periods, the movement under weight, the sustained deprivation of sleep, and comfort and warmth. But the physical was manageable. The physical was just her body, and she had a long and tested relationship with her body's capacity. The hard part was the social environment. The instructors who were professional and precise and did not treat her differently in any way that was documentable, but who had a specific quality of attention toward her that felt like waiting. Like they were waiting, collectively, for the confirmation of something they already believed. The male candidates who ranged from respectful to hostile to that particular flavor of conditional supportiveness that wanted her to succeed so long as she didn't succeed more than they did. She graduated in the top 4 of her class. She did not celebrate. She went back to her bunk and lay in the dark and thought about what came next, the way she always did when she finished one thing. Not savoring the completion, but already loading the next problem. What came next was a career that proceeded in the way that careers proceed when the person pursuing them is exceptional and the institution surrounding them is not yet ready to fully account for that exceptionality. She was assigned to support roles. She was used in situations where her gender was considered operationally advantageous. Cultural environments, certain types of intelligence gathering, contexts where a female operator could access spaces that male operators couldn't. This was real work, and she did it with complete professionalism. But she was also, beneath all of it, waiting for the moment when the real question would be asked, and she would be allowed to answer it without asterisks. That moment came in a location that cannot be named, in a year that sits in a classified file somewhere in a building in Northern Virginia, during an operation that most of the American public will never read about in any newspaper. But the men who were there know what happened, and the 12 SEALs standing in that helicopter bay know too. Because Elena Vasquez showed up in the hills above a compound at 0340 hours in the dark, with a temperature of 104 degrees from infection, that she had been treating herself for 3 days because reporting it would have meant being pulled from the operation, and she lay down in the dirt in the specific silence that she had been carrying around since she was 7 years old, watching a tin can fall off a fence post in Laredo, Texas. And she did her job. She did it at a distance that the men below would later argue about amongst themselves because the numbers seemed improbable. She did it in conditions, wind, elevation, the degraded vision that comes with fever, that should have made it impossible. She did it once. She didn't need twice. The hours before the shot were the hours nobody writes about. They write about the shot. They write about the aftermath. They write about the debrief and the medals and the moment in the helicopter bay with the SEALs and their disbelief. The moment has shape and drama and quotable lines, and so the moment gets the ink. What doesn't get the ink is the 31 hours before it, when Elena Vasquez was lying in a hide site the size of a grave, running a fever that was dismantling her by degrees, eating nothing, moving almost nothing, waiting. Waiting is the actual job. The shot is 3 seconds of a sniper's life. The rest of it, the weeks of preparation, the study of terrain and wind tables and the behavioral patterns of the target, the physical suffering of the hide, the management of your own mind over periods of time that are measured not in hours, but in something closer to geological time. That is the actual job. And for someone like Elena, whose unusual nervous system had always found stillness easier than motion, the waiting was not the hard part. The hard part was managing the fever. She had felt it coming 2 days before insertion. A tightness behind her eyes. A specific exhaustion that was different in quality from operational fatigue, which she knew as well as she knew her own hands. She did the calculation in her head while running final gear checks in a forward operating base that smelled like burned coffee and diesel and the particular sweat of men who had been in the same clothes for a long time. She had done the calculation and arrived at the conclusion that the mission timeline was shorter than the fever's trajectory, that she could complete the mission before the fever completed its own agenda. She did not tell anyone. This was a decision she would be asked about later, at length, in rooms with recording equipment, and people who wanted to understand both the tactical reasoning and the risk calculus. She answered honestly. She said that she had assessed the risk. She said that she had determined the mission had a higher probability of success with her in position than without, and that the risk to her own health was hers to carry and hers to calculate. What she did not say, and what she would not say in any official forum, was the other part of the calculation, the part that lived below the tactical reasoning, in the subterranean place where the girl from Laredo still lived. The part that understood that this mission, this specific one, was the moment she had been waiting for since 2006. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because there were men down there who were going to die if nobody was in the hills above them. And she was the person who could be in the hills above them, and she was not going to let a fever be the thing that made her absent. Commander David Hartley, the man whose life was the operational objective, in the sense that getting him out alive was the whole point of everything that was happening that night, was not supposed to be in the compound at all. That requires explanation. Hartley was a Navy SEAL commander, 15 years of operational history, the kind of officer that a certain tier of the military builds slowly and carefully over years, assigning him incrementally to harder and harder problems until he is the person you call when the problem is too complex for everyone else. He was in that compound because a very precise chain of intelligence had failed in a very precise way. The kind of failure that happens not because everyone was negligent, but because the adversary was good. He had gone in expecting an exfil that didn't materialize, and he had spent the previous 12 hours inside a structure that was increasingly surrounded by people who wanted him to never leave it. The team that had gone in to extract him was 8 men. It had gone badly. 3 of them were down by the time the revised extract plan came together. And the revised plan required something that the revised plan's architect described in the sterile language of tactical planning as establishing overwatch at elevation. What that meant in practice was somebody needed to be in the hills with a rifle, making the movement of a small and damaged team through a hostile environment survivable. Elena had been attached to the operation in a support capacity. The original plan hadn't included her in this role. The original plan had not conceived of her in this role, because the original plan had been written by people who, despite working with her directly for 14 months, still carried in their institutional imagination a ceiling above which they had not yet mentally placed her. The original plan was no longer operative. The man running the revised plan, a lieutenant colonel named Abernethy who had the deeply exhausted look of someone who had been revising plans for the past 6 hours straight, turned her not because she was the first choice, but because she was, at that moment, the correct choice. The sniper who had been designated for Overwatch had a compromised knee from a vehicle incident 2 days prior. The backup was 5 hours out. The window was 40 minutes. Abernethy looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing the calculation. She could see the specific cognitive work of a man overriding what he had always assumed with what the situation was actually requiring. She said nothing. She let him get there. He got there. She took the rifle, the one that had been prepped for the designated sniper, and that she had already checked 3 times out of habit, and she moved to the insertion point. A specialist named Okafor drove her to the base of the elevation. He said nothing for most of the drive. When she got out, he said, "Watch yourself up there." She looked at him. He was 23 years old. His hands on the steering wheel were completely steady. She said, "Keep the engine running." The climb was 45 minutes in the dark with a fever that was now sitting somewhere between 103 and 104 degrees, her body using energy to fight the infection that she needed for the climb, the gear on her back pushing her into the hillside with every step. She moved in the way she had been trained to move in darkness and hostile terrain, not fast, not slow, precisely, which is different from both. Precision over speed. Placement of every step considered before it was committed. Her breathing was controlled, but her chest was working harder than it should have been for this grade, and she noted this the way she noted everything, without emotional coloring as information. She found the position. She had studied the terrain maps until the topography was three-dimensional in her head, and the position was where the maps had said it would be, which was a relief because at this level of fever, she was not confident in her ability to improvise significant problems. The hide was shallow, barely adequate, and the ground was cold in the way that hilltops in that region were cold, a dry, penetrating cold that was going to be a problem against a body already fighting infection. She settled in. She built the position around herself. She did the adjustments that make a hasty position into something sustainable, not comfortable, survivable. She ranged the objective. She checked the wind. She called in her position on the radio in a voice that she had spent a decade constructing to be uninflected, flat, carrying nothing that a listener could use to assess her condition. Overwatch established. Eyes on objective. The response from the command element was brief and professional. But she registered, in a 2-second pause before the response, something. She registered the person on the other end performing the same revision that Abernethy had performed 40 minutes ago, now that the voice coming through the radio was hers. She did not have time to be irritated about it. She had work to do. The next 9 hours were a negotiation between her body and her discipline that she would later describe in the single paragraph she was willing to give to anyone about what it felt like as the most honest conversation she had ever had with herself. The fever peaked somewhere around hour 4, and her world became a specific, kind of degraded, not hallucination, not delirium, but a softening at the edges, a quality of unreality that she had to continuously push back against. She pushed back against it the way she pushed back against everything, directly, practically, with specific techniques. She ran multiplication tables. She went through the mechanical disassembly and reassembly of the rifle in her head, each component in sequence, tactile and precise. She thought about her father sitting in his lawn chair and the tin can on the fence post, and the way the sight picture had looked when she was 7 years old, and everything was still simple. The activity below was not constant. There were periods of relative quiet and periods of movement that she tracked through her scope with the clinical patience of someone watching something develop at its own pace. She watched the compound. She watched the patterns. She was building a model in her head of how this place breathed. When it was active, when it was still, who was where, and what their routines were, because that model was the context that would make the shot, when it came, a decision rather than reaction. Around hour 6, she heard Hartley's voice on the radio for the first time. He was in contact with the command element, updating his position and the situation inside the compound. His voice was the voice of a man who had accepted a certain level of danger and was working within it rather than against it, which told her a great deal about him before she ever saw his face. He was not panicking. He was thinking. He was, even in his current circumstances, more preoccupied with the welfare of the two men inside the compound with him than with his own. She filed this away. By hour 7, the extraction team was on the move. 8 men, now 5 operational after the 3 who had gone down earlier, moving through terrain that was being covered by 3 individuals on the threat side who were active and looking and good enough to be a serious problem. She could see 2 of them. The third was in a position she had worked out by inference, triangulating from the movement patterns of the first 2, and she was not completely certain, but she was certain enough. In sniper work, there is a standard that is described to trainees as the difference between confidence and certainty. Certainty is a luxury that the operational environment almost never provides. What you develop over years and repetition and the accumulated weight of every previous decision you've made under pressure is a calibrated confidence, a number, essentially an honest probability that your assessment is correct. The training asks you to know your number and to know what number justifies action. Elena knew her number. She was watching the compound wall where Hartley and his 2 men were going to appear in approximately 4 minutes, based on the timeline the command element had given her. She was watching the 3 threat positions. She was watching the wind indicators, a flag visible from her position, the movement of dust, the behavior of the cloth hanging from a structure 40 meters to the right of her principal target, and running continuous adjustments. The fever was trying to do something to her focus. She was not letting it. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, a figure appeared at the compound wall. Not Hartley. A threat, moving toward a position that, in 90 seconds, would give him a line of sight on the exfil route that would be lethal. She breathed out, half-breath, the specific half-breath that her father had shown her with a .22 caliber rifle and a tin can, the one that was just physics, just a reduction in movement, just the body's cooperation with what the mind had already decided. The figure stopped. She processed the data. Wind, distance, the precise location of the threat, the probability of secondary observation, the timeline, the fever, the fact that she had been in this position for 9 hours, and her body was a system that was operating at the threshold of its reserves. She made the decision the way she made all decisions under pressure. Not quickly, instantly, which is different. The shot was a distance that she later told the debrief team, and that the debrief team entered into the record, and that at least 2 of the senior people in that room would subsequently describe to their colleagues as the kind of number you heard and then spent the next few days quietly unable to stop thinking about. At that distance, under those conditions, with a fever of 104 degrees, in a hasty position after 9 hours. 1 shot. The figure went down. The second shot came 60 seconds later, the third threat having made a movement that resolved her inference into certainty, and that shot was taken from a position she had already moved to because in the 90 seconds between shots she had processed the secondary threat and adjusted and been in the new position for 40 seconds before the confirmation appeared. The exfil route was clear. Hartley came over the wall. She watched him through the scope, a tall man, moving with the controlled speed of someone who had done this before and was also aware that not everything going well meant everything was fine. He had one of his men on his back. The other was moving beside him with a leg that was clearly compromised. She watched them move to the extraction point. She watched the 2 threat positions that remained active, and she kept them in the scope through the entire movement, and she was not called upon to fire again. She heard Hartley's voice on the radio when the team reached the extraction point. Overwatch. Team is out. 2 down, 3 walking. What's your status? She paused 1 second before answering. Overwatch is up. The pause was the only thing she would give the fever. 1 second. Then she was back. The helicopter came 22 minutes later. She was already moving down the hillside by the time it landed, already calculating how much water she needed and what the most likely medical intervention for her current condition would be, already in the next problem. Okafor was exactly where she had left him, engine running, face expressionless in the way of someone who had been sitting in a vehicle for 10 hours trying not to imagine what was happening on the hill above him. She got in. He drove. Neither of them said anything for 3 minutes. Then Okafor said quietly, looking at the road ahead, "You got everybody out?" She looked at her hands. They were not shaking. They never had been. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. That was all. But she was already somewhere else in her head. Because she knew She had known from the moment she heard the half-second pause before Abernethy's voice on the radio back at the FOB, from the moment she saw the look on Okafor's face when he drove her to the insertion point in the dark. She knew that the thing that was about to happen next was going to require a different kind of steadiness. Not the stillness of the hide site, not the quiet of the scope. A different kind, because the men she had just pulled out of that compound were about to meet her face to face. And they were going to have to decide who she was. Across a decade of service and a career that had been built in the negative spaces of an institution that wasn't ready for her, Elena Vasquez had gotten quite good at watching men make that decision. She knew the stages of it. The initial scan, the assessment, the revision, the thing that happened in the eyes when the revision completed. She had watched that sequence play out in training facilities and briefing rooms and forward operating bases from here to the places that don't have names you can say in polite company. She knew the sequence. She had never, in all those years, known exactly what to do with herself while it happened. Because no matter how many times she had stood in that revision, watching men rewrite their assumptions in real time, there was always a cost to it. Always the moment of delay between what the evidence was saying and what the person looking at the evidence was willing to believe. That delay was small. It measured in fractions of seconds. But it was never zero, and in those fractions, in that space between who they had assumed she was and who she actually was, Elena Vasquez had spent most of her adult life. Not angry, not resigned, just present, waiting for them to catch up. She was very good at waiting. The helicopter bay smelled like hydraulic fluid and dried blood and the specific exhaustion of men who had been operating past their limits for too long. Elena walked in and stood to one side. She had been triaged by the flight medic on the helicopter, her fever noted, and 4-line placed in her arm that she was now wearing without ceremony, the bag of saline taped to her shoulder strap because her hands were occupied. She looked, objectively, like a person who had been through something. She did not look like what the 12 men in that bay had spent the last 40 minutes constructing in their heads. Because for 40 minutes while she was being processed and hydrated, and while the tactical debrief was being assembled in the room 2 doors down, those 12 men had been talking. Not loudly, not theatrically, in the compressed, efficient shorthand of men who communicate the way she shot. Minimum input, maximum transfer. They had been talking about the shots, about the distance, about the conditions, about the 9 hours in the hide site, about the fact that the commander they were looking at right now, sitting on a crate with his ribs taped and his face holding the specific quality of a man who had recently accepted that he was still alive, was only still alive because of someone they had never met. They had a name. They had been given a name, because names travel in that world the way water travels, finding every crack and working through every closed door. The name was not Elena Vasquez. In the circles where operational snipers were discussed in the specific and loaded way that operators discussed the people they would actually trust with their lives, there was a different name. A field name that had accumulated over 3 years of quiet and unattributed work in theaters where she was not officially supposed to be doing what she was actually doing. The name was spoken the way you spoke about something that was possibly not completely real, with a slight hesitation, with the tone of a story that was too clean to be entirely true. The Master Chief who had whispered the question, his name was Decker, 14 years in, the kind of man whose career was itself a kind of argument about what the human body and mind were capable of sustaining, had heard the name twice. Once from a Marine raider in Djibouti, who said it the way you say the name of something you personally witnessed, but cannot entirely explain. Once from a JSOC targeting officer who had said it without the hesitation, flatly, as a fact, and whose delivery told Decker that whatever the story was, it had been verified at a level above his clearance. And now she was standing in the bay. She was not tall. She was not anything that the stories had suggested she would be. Physically, because the stories hadn't specified, and what Decker's mind had assembled in the absence of specifics was something more archetypal, more proportioned to the mythology. She was compact, and she was very still, and she was wearing a fever and in 4 bag, and there was something in her face, not hardness exactly, not coldness, but a quality of containment that he recognized from the men he most respected, the quality of someone who had packed away the enormous and was operating now entirely in the present. She looked at them. She did not perform anything. Decker said, in a voice that carried just far enough to reach the question without announcing it to the entire room. You're the one they call the ghost? It was not the most elegant question he had ever asked, but it was the only one he had. She looked at him for a moment. The pause was not dramatic. She was simply finishing a thought before she spoke, which was a habit she had never bothered to modify because she did not find most situations improved by faster talking. I don't know what they call me, she said. What happened to your commander? The deflection was not evasion. It was priorities. Decker, who understood priorities at a cellular level, registered this and felt something shift in his assessment. Not the shift itself, but the quality of it. The way it moved fast and complete like a lock that had been trying to find its combination and had just found it. 3 cracked ribs. 1 through in the shoulder. He'll be back in 8 weeks. He paused. He asked to see you. She looked at the floor bag. She looked at the floor. Something moved across her face that Decker couldn't read, and he was a man who could read most things. Not distress. Not reluctance. Something more interior than either. Give me 10 minutes, she said. She used the 10 minutes in the bathroom at the end of the corridor. She stood at the sink with the water running cold, and she looked at herself in the metal mirror, the type of mirror that the military installs everywhere, slightly distorted, as if it wants to spare you the exact truth. She had not looked at herself in 31 hours. The woman in the distorted metal was not a disaster, but she was undeniably a person who had spent 31 hours in a hole on a hillside of high fever. And she was aware that the next room contained a man who was alive because of what those 31 hours had cost, and she did not know what to do with that weight. This was the part nobody trained you for. The shooting, yes. There were schools, instructors, feedback loops, objective metrics. She knew exactly how good she was at that part, because the part had a grammar she had spent her life learning. But this part, the part where the consequences of the work looked at you with their eyes and said something with their mouth, this part had no school, no metric, no objective assessment tool. She was 34 years old, and she had been moving away from this part of the work for her entire career. She dried her hands. She straightened the one thing that could be straightened. She went back down the corridor. Commander David Hartley was sitting up. The tape on his ribs was visible under the hospital shirt someone had found for him, and his left arm was in a sling, and his face was the face of a man in the specific pain of fractured bones. Medicated, but not gone, just made into something navigable. He was alone in the room, which was unusual enough that she noted it. Someone had made sure of it. That was a choice, and she understood what the choice was saying. She stopped in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were the color of something she couldn't name, immediately gray-green like water over stone, and they were doing the revision that she knew so well. But there was something different in how he did it. The revision was fast, not because he was incurious, but because she understood in that moment, a person who had long since resolved the question that most people were still arguing about. He was simply locating her in what he already knew to be true, not fighting the data, not negotiating with it. He said, "They told me the shot was 900 meters. 940, she said. He looked at her. 1 inch difference at that range, he said, and I'm not in this room. She didn't say anything. My right shoulder, he said. He moved the hand of the uninjured arm to touch the slung arm, a gesture that was not conscious, just the body checking the fact of itself. I was standing at the compound wall, and the man who was going to kill me was standing 40 meters to my left and was already raising his weapon. I know what I was looking at. I know what the angle was. 940 meters in that wind in the dark." He paused. "You were running a fever." This was not a question. He had clearly already spoken to someone who had access to the medic's notes. She said, "That's accurate." He looked at her again. It was not the look she was used to from men in his position. Not disbelief, not the particular kind of unsettled that men got when reality declined to behave the way their category system had predicted. It was something else. It was the look of a person performing an honest accounting, adding up what had been spent by whom on his behalf. "Why didn't you report the fever?" he said. She met his eyes. She had been asked this question already in the preliminary debrief, and she had given the tactical answer, the professional answer, the answer that accounted for probability of mission success. She gave him the same answer. It was true. It was just not the complete truth. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is there anything you need?" It was such a simple question. So direct. No performance in it. No choreography. Just a man asking a person who had spent herself on his behalf what she needed now. She was not prepared for the simplicity of it. In the 31 hours in hindsight, and the fever, and the shots, and the helicopter, and the 4-bag, and the 10 minutes at the sink, and all of it, she had not once thought about that question. She said the first honest thing that had come out of her mouth in hours. "I need to sleep," she said. He nodded. "Then sleep," he said. And then, because he was a person who understood that some things needed to be said plainly, who had perhaps learned the hard way that the unsaid thing had a cost he was no longer willing to pay, he said, "I'm going to make sure what happened today doesn't stay where it's supposed to stay." She looked at him. She understood what he was saying. The operational world had a specific gravity that pulled exceptional things towards silence. There were classification structures and bureaucratic inertias and institutional cultures that, in combination, had the practical effect of making extraordinary work disappear. She had watched this happen to other people. She had watched it happen to herself. She had built her career in the full understanding that this was the landscape, and she had made her peace with it the way you make peace with weather. Not happily, but practically, because the alternative was spending all your energy on something you couldn't change. She did not know if she believed him. She did not say she didn't believe him. She said, "Thank you, Commander," and she meant both the thanks and the title, the formality of the title a conscious choice, a small and necessary distance. He understood the distance. He didn't push on it. She walked back out into the corridor. Decker was there. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and his face doing the thing his face did when he was thinking about something and had decided not to make noise about it. He looked at her. She stopped. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. It was a different question than the one she had been asked in debrief rooms. Debrief rooms asked about operational parameters and decision matrices and rules of engagement. Decker was asking something that did not have an entry in any official form. She thought about it. The real answer, not the career answer. "Since I was 7, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, he did something she didn't expect. He nodded, not the nod of a man being polite. The nod of a man placing something in a category where it belonged, completing a process, closing a file. The nod of recognition. "There's a name people use," he said, "in the community, for someone with a particular combination of ability," and he searched for the word, endurance. That's the word they use. Endurance. Not just physical. She waited. "They've been using it for about 3 years, he said. Nobody knew the name attached to it. People argued about whether the person was real or whether it was the kind of story that grows in the telling. She could feel where this was going. "It's real," she said flatly. He looked at her. His expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness changed, became more deliberate, the way very still water becomes when something moves beneath it. "Yes," he said. "It is." She went to the bunk room that had been assigned to her. She lay down on the bunk in her clothes, the 4-bag still attached because she hadn't asked them to take it out yet. The ceiling of the bunk room was the standard institutional ceiling of everywhere she had ever been. That same slightly off-white surface with the same slight imperfection in the plaster that she had stared at in dozens of equivalent rooms across 15 years. She stared at it. She thought about her father in his lawn chair. She thought about Marco, who had been 19 and was now nothing but a thing that had happened in the past that she carried. She thought about Staff Sergeant Briggs, who had said you've got a gift for the long game, and then rotated out, and she had never seen him again and didn't know if he was alive or dead. She thought about the debrief rooms and the applications that were rejected and the silences when she walked into spaces that had never expected her, and the way she had spent 15 years in the gap between who she was and who the institution was prepared to see. She thought about Hartley's eyes doing the revision, the fast version, the one that didn't negotiate. She thought about Decker's nod. She closed her eyes. The fever broke at 0400. She felt it go, a specific release, the body calling off the emergency that had been running for 4 days, the internal temperature dropping back to something the body recognized as neutral. She lay there for a moment in the damp of the sheets and felt the absence of the fever the way you feel the absence of a sound you hadn't consciously registered until it stopped. She thought, "I'm still here." Not triumphant, not relieved, just noting the fact of it. The way she noted the tin can falling off the fence post when she was 7. The way she noted the distance of every shot. The way she noted everything directly, honestly, without embellishment, without apology. She was still here. What happened next? The official commendations, the classified recognition, the conversations that took place in rooms with sealed doors between men with serious titles about a woman named Elena Vasquez, and what her existence meant for things that were larger than any single operation. None of that happened quickly. The military does not move quickly when it is updating its understanding of itself. But it moves. It moves the way all heavy things move when they finally commit to a direction, slowly, and then with a weight that makes the previous stillness hard to remember. Hartley kept his word. This surprised some people and surprised nobody who knew him. Decker went back to his team and said nothing specific and everything necessary in the way of a man who understood that some information moved best without being spoken directly. The 12 men in the helicopter bay each went back to their own operational contexts. And in those contexts, in the forward operating bases and the briefing rooms and the quiet moments in vehicles between one place and another, the story moved the way it always had, in fragments and half sentences, in a specific frequency of people who were saying something important in the only register that their world trusted. Elena was given the fever medication. She should have been given 4 days earlier, and a mandatory 72-hour stand down, and a subsequent debrief that lasted 11 hours across 2 days and left the debrief team, a rotating cast of senior officers and intelligence personnel who collectively held approximately 200 years of experience in the world she had been operating in, sitting in a room afterward, not quite looking at each other, processing. She came back to her unit. She did her job. She had always done her job. The difference now, and this difference was small, and she monitored it the way she monitored everything, with a steady and unillusioned attention. The difference was that the institution had started to catch up to the fact of her. Not all the way. Not without friction. Not without the specific ongoing cost of existing in a structure that was revising itself in real time while she was standing inside it. But the revision was happening. She thought about that sometimes, in the quiet moments, in the specific silence of a hide site or an empty bunk room, or the back of a vehicle moving through terrain she was already mapping with her eyes. She thought about the revision and what it meant, and whether it mattered in the way that she had once needed it to matter, back when she was young enough that the institution's opinion of her was something she carried around as a live weight. She found, at 34, that she was less interested in the institution's revision than she had expected to be. Not indifferent, not bitter, something more considered than either. She was interested in the next problem. She was interested in being the person in the hills when the person in the hills was what the moment needed. She was interested in the job. The rest of it, the names, the mythology, the seals in the helicopter bay with their silence, and their revision, and the question that Decker had whispered like a man asking about something he wasn't sure was allowed to be real. The rest of it was the world doing what the world does with things it doesn't have a category for. She had been in that gap her whole life. She knew how to wait.